Two things I forgot to mention earlier. If you notice my cough, I don't have COVID, okay? I just have allergies, and so I have a perennial chronic cough. So pray for my wife. She has to listen to it. And then the other thing I forgot to mention earlier, I told you a little bit about myself, but I'm a missionary, a full-time missionary with Jews for Jesus. Maybe you've heard of it. And and I'm part of our online evangelism team, and I've been for a few years with that. I've been on staff 38 years, so with the ministry, and served largely in Southern California, and then since 2007 in Northern California. Yeah.
Did you say you're a missionary in California?
Uh-huh. Yeah, why a missionary in California, right? But actually, my ministry is really, it stems the world, because the internet's the first, we like to say, the 21st century street corner. And a lot of Jewish people come into our website wanting to know more. And it's kind of a way, an anonymous way of being able to come to find out more about Jesus without people breathing down your neck and knowing you're even thinking about it. So, yeah, so that's a little bit more about me. But I wanted to get into the second session now. I mentioned that we're going to be talking about anti-Semitism. What is it and why is it, right? And so, having talked a little bit about the basics of Judaism earlier, now we're going to look at this issue that it's a current issue, obviously, in Israel and around the world. And it's affected lots of Jewish people over the centuries. And again, it's anti-Semitism. But what is it exactly, right? You've probably heard the term before. And so I looked up a definition of it in Merriam-Webster's. I'm sure you all know about that dictionary, whatever. The definition is hostility toward or discrimination against Jews as a religious, ethnic, or racial group. Okay? Now, anti means against. Semi or Semitism, right? What is a Semite? Because that's where the term comes from, is for Semitism. It's a member of any of the peoples that speak or spoke a Semitic language, namely Jews and Arabs. So surprisingly enough, Arabs, in a sense, are Semites also, okay? And I'll explain more about that. The name actually comes from the Greek word Sem or Shem. Now, does the name Shem sound familiar to you? Who's Shem in the Bible? He's one of the sons of Noah, exactly. So the Jews, in essence, Abraham was a descendant of Shem, right? So, as I said, anti-Semitism has been prevalent over many centuries. And though there are surface external expressions of anti-Semitism, like what's going on right now in Israel and Gaza, of course, there's a spiritual dimension to all of this which supersedes language. I want to get to it by looking at the scriptures and look at Genesis chapter 12, verse 7 for a minute, okay? And I'll read that for us. Sorry, Genesis chapter 12, verse 7. Just a short verse here. And it says, "Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your offspring I will give this land.' So he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him." Okay. So the Lord told Abram, or later on Abraham, his name was changed by God, "To your offspring I will give this land." Now, that sounds pretty straightforward, right? Well, let's continue in chapter 15, verses 1 to 6. Somebody like to read that? Caitlin, you're our reader. Why don't you read for us? Great, thanks. So at this point, Abraham and Sarah, his wife, are childless, and humanly speaking, the chances of her having a child at the age of, I think she was around 75 at the time, and Abraham was about 85, so the chances were pretty slim to none that she was going to have a child, right? So because of disbelief, Abraham gives God his input on what God just told him, right? Have we ever done that before? Right? Now, he suggests that Eliezer, one of his own household servants, should be the one through whom God's promises were to be fulfilled. Obviously, God needs help, right? Now, God tells Abraham that that wasn't going to be necessary, but that Abraham's own physical son would be his heir. Then, the next chapter, chapter 16, we're reminded that Sarah was childless. She actually says to Abraham that the Lord had prevented her from bearing children in verse 2 of chapter 16. It says, and Sarai said to Abram, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. So, just as Abraham thought that he knew enough to help God, now what do we have? We have Sarah doing the same thing, don't we? Hey, God's got a problem. I got the solution, right? So she tells Abraham to have relations, sexual relations, with her maidservant Hagar so that she might have children through her. Now, I know that sounds strange today, right? But the Bible Knowledge Commentary states, in the legal custom of that day, a barren woman could give her maid to her husband as a wife, and the child born of that union was regarded as the first wife's child. If the husband said to the slave wife's son, you are my son, then he was the adopted and heir. So Sarah's suggestion was unobjectionable according to the customs of the time. But God often repudiates social customs, okay? Does that make sense? So culturally speaking, there was nothing wrong with what she was thinking. On a spiritual level, that was another story, though. Because what do we call that? Well, it's adult, and in our culture today it would be. I'd say a lack of faith. I mean, she didn't trust God, right? God made a promise, and she thought, oh, never going to work out. I got to take care of things myself. So the outcome then is Hagar gives birth to a son named Ishmael. However, after she becomes pregnant, Hagar shows contempt for Sarah, and Sarah then approaches Abraham about this, and he tells her to deal with it. So Sarah does, and Hagar flees from them. However, the angel of the Lord finds Hagar and instructs her to return to Sarah after promising Hagar that her offspring would be multiplied without number. He also tells her to call the child Ishmael, which means the Lord has listened to your affliction. And that's actually in verse 11. So as we think about that, despite Sarah and Abraham's faithless attempt in trying to fulfill God's promise to them, and the result, we still see God's grace toward Hagar and Ishmael as shown according to the angel's announcement. Think about that for a minute. They screwed things up, and what did God do? God didn't hold Hagar and Ishmael responsible for the fact that Abraham and Sarah were faithless toward him at that point, right? So, not only do we know now that Abraham was the father of Isaac, but he was the father of Ishmael as well. And so he's the father of a multitude through the son that was promised by God, which was Isaac. But think about that for a minute. He's the father of a multitude through Ishmael also. I mean, all the way to this day when you think of the Arab nations, right? Now, today there is strife between Israel and the surrounding Arab countries. We know that. It's very obvious. So the focus of this dispute today, of course, seems to be over the land, right? That Israel occupies. But remember that in Genesis 15:7, God states to Abraham and his offspring that his descendants would possess the land, as we see there in chapter 15, verse 18 following. But the question remains, to which of his offspring? To the offspring of him and Sarah, or of him and Hagar, right? So I think verse 13 gives us further insight into which offspring God is speaking of. This is a prophecy concerning their enslavement in Egypt for 400 years, which we know to be through Isaac and Jacob. It says there in verse 13, then the Lord said to Abram, excuse me, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Okay, following me so far? Okay, and then in verse 16 we're told that they shall come back to this land. Remember, where is Abraham at this point in time when God is speaking to him? Remember, this is prior to the 400 years of captivity in Egypt. So where's God speaking to Abraham right now? It's Canaan. Remember earlier I mentioned that he came from the Chaldeans. God called him to come to, well, maybe I didn't mention that yet, but anyway, so he's in Canaan right now, and God's telling him in the future, your descendants are going to be enslaved in Egypt, in a land not their own for 400 years. We know that all happened, right? And then in verse 16, it tells us that they shall come back to this land in the 4th generation, led by Moses and Joshua, as seen in the book of Exodus, right? And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Okay? Any questions about that particular verse? Why that's there? Okay. Well, it's 400 years that they're in Egypt, right? So I think that's the reason why it's the 4th generation. Yeah, Brock.
My version is NLT, and it says, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction.
Right. That's good.
What does that mean? Why? Is there a limit?
Well, there's a reason for that. I don't know if you heard what Brock was asking just now about why is it that the Amorites are supposed to be destroyed? The time hadn't come yet. Well, the Amorites were one of the peoples that lived in the land of Canaan. And as I mentioned earlier, they were pagans. They were idol worshippers. They sacrificed their children to the idols and all of this. So when the Israelites came back to conquer the land of Canaan, following the 400 years in Egypt, following the 40 years in the wilderness, when they were supposed to cross the Jordan, they were supposed to kill the Canaanites and the people living in the land. Why? It was God's judgment on their practices. Okay? So at this point, God is telling Abram that it isn't yet that it came to the point of where the Amorites were ready for the judgment that was to come. Does that make sense? Okay, God has a timetable. Anybody know that? Sometimes his timetable doesn't match up with our timetable. That's another story. But God's on a timetable. All right? So then another passage that gives us a clear indication concerning the land and its ownership is in Genesis 35, verses 11 to 13. And somebody like to read that? Caitlin, you want to do us the honors? Tell me if I'm putting too much on you. Okay. Chapter 35, verse 11 to 13.
And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and a king shall come from your own body. The land that I give to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give you the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken to him.
Okay, great. So, as I said earlier, there's a spiritual dimension to all of this contention over the land and the greater issue of anti-Semitism. You know, we're looking at things on a surface level. You know, if you're familiar with history and all, we think of Israel becoming a state. We think of the UN. We think of, Rick asked me if I could say something about this. It was like kind of on the spur of the moment when he picked us up at the airport the other day. As far as, the Balfour Declaration and the UK, Great Britain, and how they divided up the land. It was initially part of their possession. They divided into Transjordan and all this other stuff. This happened in the 1900s. So there's a lot of that stuff that was going on. So from a physical standpoint, we look at the nations and how the land was divided up in contemporary times. But below all of that, there is a spiritual dimension, okay? And a verse that clearly shows this, actually, is in Deuteronomy 32:10, which is a part of what's called the Song of Moses. And it says in chapter 32:10 of Deuteronomy, he found him in a desert land, and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. And that's speaking about the Jewish people in essence. So the sons of Israel are referred to as the apple of God's eye, telling us something about God's special love for his people and his commitment to them. But at the same time, we're also aware of a spiritual being that's adamantly opposed to God's plans, stemming all the way back to the Garden of Eden, yeah? It is the evil one, known in Hebrew as Hasatan. You better know him as Satan, right? Hasatan means the adversary, the opponent, the devil. And throughout Scripture, he rears his ugly head, showing his contempt for God. For instance, the first place is actually in Genesis chapter 3, where the serpent tempts Eve to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and puts into question what God's instructions were to her, right? Then, in Genesis 11:4, there's another example of this, an example of the influence of Satan. As humanity seeks to do what? Anybody remember what happens in Genesis 11? The Tower of Babel, right? What do the people want to do that time? That's right. They wanted to be like God. They wanted to build a tower up to heaven, right? And so what happened then? As they were building this tower, reaching up to heaven, the Lord decided to disperse them, all the people at that point, over the face of the whole earth and confound their languages also, so they couldn't come up with a plan somehow to try to thwart God. All of this is from who? It's the evil one. Sin nature. So it's a rebellion against God and his authority. And just as an aside, right after that, we're given the genealogy of Shem, the son of Noah, all the way up to Abram or Abraham. You following? So you had the destruction of the world, in essence. Noah was saved, And then the promises went to Shem of his 3 sons, right? Then later on in the scriptures, there are many examples of Satan's schemes against God's chosen people. Unfortunately, what happened to Israel, or the Jewish people, using those 2 terms now, was often the result of their own sin or rebellion, their own disobedience towards God, through their idolatry and other sinful things that they did, which is obviously because of Satan's influence and his opposition to God. For example, I mentioned earlier in the first lesson, the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivities. Those were all judgments from God because of the Jewish people's disobedience toward him. Also, during the Persian period, a bit later on, we have a book in the Bible, the book of Esther. Remember that book? Okay. Does anybody remember who the evil person was in the book of Esther? Haman. That's right. Jewish customs, when we celebrate Purim, which is a festival when Esther is read, every time we hear the name Haman, you know what we do? We say, boo! Because the whole Megillah, we call it, the whole book of Esther is read. So for Haman, I'm getting off subject a little bit, but I wanted to just tell you. So with Haman, you get boo. With Mordecai, you get yay. And then with Esther, you get ah. Anyway, yeah. You get it. You get the picture. So it's a fun Purim celebration. But getting back to this, Haman was a villain in all this. And what did he want to do? Destroy the Jewish people. Okay, and this is during the Persian period after the Babylonian period, because there were Jews that were allowed to go back to Israel after the Babylonian captivity. But there were a lot of Jews that decided to remain. And then the Persians came into power. Okay, and so they were under the Persians, and under the Persians, that's when you have that period, that time period with Haman and Mordecai and Esther. Okay. Then, later on, in the period between the Old and the New Testament, we call it the intertestamental period, 2nd century BC, there's another historical event in which the Syrian Greek Empire, and this guy by the name of Antiochus, or Antiochus Epiphanes, maybe you've heard that term before, he wanted to annihilate or assimilate the Jewish people into the greater Syrian Empire, Syrian Greek Empire. And then there was a people, or a family, I should say, of the Jews who fought back. And there's a holiday that we celebrate usually at the end of the year around Christmas, right? Jewish holiday. Anybody know the name of that one? Hanukkah. And what is Hanukkah all about? Hanukkah takes place in this intertestamental period when the Jews were about to be killed, and they fought back through this family known as the Maccabees. Remember that? Actually, their family name was Hasmoneans, but they were nicknamed the Maccabees because in Hebrew, the word Maccabee means a hammer. And so what does that tell you about this family? They're going to hammer back. They're going to fight against Antiochus and the Syrian Greeks. Okay. And then following that time and prior to and during the New Testament period, what do we have next? The Roman Empire subjecting Israel, and ultimately the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD, followed by the diaspora, fancy name for the dispersion of the Jewish people from Israel. Then after that, if you haven't had enough, right? After that, 3 of the most well-known demonstrations of anti-Semitism up to the present are the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, in which the Jews were given the choice of being baptized or dying, converting to Christianity or dying. And then finally, and the most horrific, of course, of all is the Nazi Holocaust, in which there was a result of the annihilation of 6 million Jews in Europe. Okay? So do you see all of these things, the undercurrent of all of this? It's all Satan that's under this all. We, as people, we just look at the surface, we listen to the news, what have you, and we just listen to commentators and what they're talking about. But you notice, nobody ever talks about the spiritual dimension of it. But there is a spiritual dimension under all of this. And remember that Israel and the Jewish people, I said earlier, the apple of God's eye. And I wanted to point out that our people are often referred to as a chosen people. But I want to make sure you understand that, what that means. We're not chosen as Jews because there's anything special about us. Okay? The reason why we're special is because God chose us. In fact, you remember that God had said that through Abraham and his descendants, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Well, how would that be accomplished? Through his people. Okay, so we're chosen for God's purpose, not because there's anything special about Jewish people. Okay, so if you meet any Jewish people who have chips on their shoulders, generally it's Jewish people that aren't believers in Jesus. If you meet people like that, because they don't understand what chosen, what that really means, what chosenness is. But we do, because we know the scriptures, we know the Bible, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Any questions so far on any of this? Okay. Yeah, bro.
This might be a very silly question, but do you think that, that the Jews are still God's chosen people?
I believe that they are, in the sense that God made a covenant, an everlasting covenant. If we're not going to get into it right now, but if you look up Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11, the Apostle Paul, who was a Jewish Christian, Jewish believer in Jesus, studied under Gamaliel, famous rabbi of the first century, and God called him to be what? The apostle to the Gentiles, right? And even in chapter 1 of Romans, it says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to all those who believe, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek," or to the Gentile. So God isn't done with the Jewish people yet. God still has a plan for the Jewish people. And if you look at chapters 9, 10, and 11 of Romans, you'll see that. Now, I will tell you, unfortunately, there are certain denominations within Christianity today where they have this view of supersessionism, it's a fancy term, or replacement theology, that the church has replaced Israel, the Jewish people. It hasn't, but it's a different kind of a relationship that God has with believers. But God is not finished with the Jewish people yet. I know it's a long-winded answer, but hopefully that helps. Yeah.
I got a kind of complicated question, but what's that mean to be chosen?
Here's the thing. First of all, from a very worldly standpoint, I would say that God has blessed Jewish people in a lot of areas that have made good things happen in the world, in terms of health, in terms of wealth, which unfortunately very often, has been the reason why Jewish people have been persecuted. But, a lot of different things, medical, entertainment industry, education. If you go to any major university or whatever, you find there are a lot of Jewish professors, there are a lot of Jewish writers. So God has blessed the Jewish people to use them for the betterment of the world. But here's the thing. How did God ultimately fulfill his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to bless all the nations, that all the nations of the earth would be blessed by you through Jesus. The ultimate Jew, if you will, the God-man, right? And so that's why, I don't know if that answers your question. In the chosenness, God had a purpose from the very beginning, ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. Okay, he was the one that came into the world, and he died for the sins of the world in order that the world could be restored in our relationship to God. Okay? Yeah. Brody.
Do you believe killing is wrong?
Yes, of course I do. And Brody, that's not part of the present conversation, so we can talk about it a little bit later if that's okay. Okay? Anybody else related to this one? Yeah.
This might be like oversimplifying it, I guess, but so in your opinion, would you say that Jews are like the chosen people as well as Christians?
Well, you know what? That's a really great question. Because there is a chosenness, of course, depending on your theology and different Christian theologies, the idea of what is chosenness. Does God choose people from the beginning of time? How does that all work out? Predestination, in particular. I was trying to remember the term, but personally, I would think that, when people come to faith in Jesus, I believe we have nothing in and of ourselves to be able to make that decision. That I think God does give us, who come to faith in him, the ability to do that. If you look at John chapter 1, verse 13, I think it is. Verse 13, I think. It talks about it's not by flesh, it's not by blood, it's not by ancestry or anything like that, but it's by God that somebody comes to faith. So, yeah. So I think that there is a chosenness in the spiritual sense also, that true born-again Christians, believers, are chosen by God. Now, the other questions we could ask, but I don't want to get into because it's off the subject, which is, well, why does God choose some and not others and all? I don't want to get there. Okay, I know what people think, or I have this idea that might be a question that people are thinking about. I don't want to get into it right now, okay? I'll let the pastors, I'll let Dane deal with it. Give it to Dane, or give it to Rick, or Tony, okay? But anyway, getting back to the notes. Okay, so let's look at some verses that relate to all of this regarding Jesus, okay, as the ultimate fulfillment. Isaiah 42, verse 6 and 7. Let's go there. If you have your Bible, it's in the middle of your Bible, okay, coincidentally. Chapter 42, verse 6 and 7. Is there anybody else that would be interested in reading? Okay, thanks, Brock. Don't get mad. Brock is a nice guy. Anyway.
I, the Lord, have called you to demonstrate my righteousness. I will take you by the hand and guard you, and I will give you to my people Israel, as a symbol of my covenant with them. And you will be a light to guide the nations. You will open the eyes of the blind. You will free the captives from prison, releasing those who sit in dark dungeons.
Great. And why don't you continue Isaiah 49, verse 6.
He says, you will do more than restore the people of Israel to me. I will make you a light to the Gentiles, and you will bring my salvation to the ends of the earth.
Great. Thanks. So, and then in the New Testament, we see a few verses which fulfill these prophetic words about Jesus, the fulfillment of God's call on Israel. Would somebody read John chapter 1, verse 1 to 5? Anybody? Okay, Tucker. You win. You're next, Juju.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being by him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and life was the light of man. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness could not comprehend it.
Okay. And would you continue in verses 9 to 13?
There was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believed in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God.
There you go. The verse I just mentioned a minute ago, answering the question about, well, chosenness, right? And then chapter 8, John 8, verse 12, Jesus also makes the following statement concerning himself. It says, I'll give you a chance to get there. John chapter 8, verse 12. Okay, it says, again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have what? The light of life, right. So the reason for mentioning all of this is that Satan, in his opposition toward God and wanting to thwart God's plan of salvation, has chosen to strike or to attack his chosen people. However, we know that he's already been defeated when Jesus died on the cross for our sins and was raised from the dead. Let's turn to Colossians chapter 1, verse 13 and 14. And Juju works great. Juju? Okay. Okay, Colossians 1, 13 and 14.
He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins.
Great. So notice there, he's delivered us from the domain of darkness. What domain is that? Think about that. Who's the prince of the power of this world? Satan. He's delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. So, to conclude, let me ask the question we began with. Anti-Semitism, what is it and why is it? Thoughts? Now that we've talked about this a bit, doesn't have to be a review, but I mean, now, what are your thoughts? What are your questions? Yeah.
I don't know. This might be like a hard question. This is like, it's kind of sensitive. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how to ask it. But like, a lot of people would see like some Jewish people would see like criticism of the state of Israel as anti-Semitic. And I just want to know like what your thoughts are on that.
That the state of Israel is anti-Semitic?
No, like if you were to criticize the state of Israel.
Oh, it's that's anti-Semitic towards Israel because of everything going on right now, you mean?
Yeah.
That they are feeling anti-Semitic in light of everything going on. Is that what you mean? Or
Well, yeah, but also like, like I don't know, like if you were to criticize Israel, like maybe in like a good way, like maybe if you were to point out something like, oh, I don't, like a lot of people would take that as anti-Semitism. Does that make sense?
I'm not quite sure. I'm slow sometimes.
I'll figure out how to rephrase it, and I'll ask you.
Okay. Yeah. Anybody else? Come on. Brody, if it's related to this? Am I a racist? No. Is racism sin? See, Jewish people often ask a question. When they are asked a question, they answer the question with a question. So, what do you think? You asked me if I'm a racist. I said, what is racism? Yeah. Not. Yeah. Anybody else? Come on, we have 5 more minutes. I know you want a break. Anyway, Juju.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just like a thought. You said any thoughts? It's like I haven't seen it before in the light of, oh, it is a spiritual persecution of God's people. Like in that sense, it's kind of interesting having that pointed out and seeing it in a new light.
Isn't that really amazing? Because, I mean, most recently, and of course, none of you, even me, I'm not old enough to remember the Holocaust other than hearing accounts of things from my parents. But, when you look at history, you think, why were there these Nazis that hated, of course, not just Jewish people, other peoples as well, obviously. Why was there such hatred? Where did it come from? And on a human level, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense that anybody could be that and devise the kinds of schemes that people came up with to annihilate people. It's like, who is that brilliant, and why would they even have a reason to do such a thing? But it's a spiritual thing underneath it all. Yeah. Tucker, were you raising your hand or were you yawning?
Why did he choose Jews?
You know what? I don't know. Sometimes our people say, I wish you would have chosen somebody else. It's because, hey, you know what? With the good is the bad. God chose the Jewish people. What did he choose us for? Persecution? I mean, if you happen to be Jewish and you have, the history of your family, there are people I minister to. There's a guy, trying to remember, his name is Alex. He's from the former Soviet Union. And Alex, he's in his mid to late 70s. He lost a lot of family in the Holocaust, in Auschwitz and all. He's a believer in Jesus now. But I mean, he could ask the same question. He could say, why? So much of my family were killed in the death camps and all of that. Why? So it's like, is it a luxury to be part of the chosen people? Yes and no, maybe. Maybe because we're chosen by God, which is a cool thing. But at the same time, what does that make us? It puts a target on our backs, and ultimately where Jesus was the final target, and Satan thought he won, when Jesus died. Yeah.
So with that, would you say, this is like a dumb question, but
No dumb questions. Yeah. It's okay.
would you say Jews are more special than not a Jew? No.
Like I said earlier, you might have missed it. Jewish people weren't chosen by God because they were anything special. What makes Jewish people special is that God chose them. It's not because there's anything special about Jewish people. Remember, Abraham wasn't Jewish. Abraham was from a pagan family living in Mesopotamia, and God called him out. In fact, according to Jewish tradition, it's not in the Bible, is that Abraham's father was an idol maker. And we see things, trying to remember, I think it's Isaac or Jacob, I always forget, when they got Rachel, or when they got the wife, Rebecca, they stole the idols of Laban. I don't know if you remember that story, when he got his wives. I think it was actually Rachel and Leah, now I remember. when they were finally able to leave Laban after 21 years that he had served under him, Jacob left with Rachel and Leah, and Rachel stole some of the family idols. Okay? But they were part of the Hebrews still. Okay? So it's interesting. Even then, there was idols and stuff like that. So could God have chosen somebody else? Sure. Why did he choose, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? God knows. Why does he choose some to believe in Jesus and others he doesn't choose to believe in Jesus? I don't know. God knows. He knows the end from the beginning. And that's kind of the simplest answer I could give. I know it doesn't always satisfy, but yeah. Hopefully that helps. Yeah, Brock. Yes. Yes. The difference, Sandy came to faith independent of me 49 years ago, and it was through a Lutheran high school friend that had the courage to witness to her, to tell her about Jesus. And she saw something different in Kathy's life, and then Kathy was going to church, and she invited Sandy to go to her youth group thing, and she went and she came to faith. And then totally different, her experience and mine. Her parents were very upset when they finally found out. In my parents, I didn't share my whole testimony. I could do that another time maybe. But when they found out, they said, you either give this up or you move out. And she was 18. And she moved out and moved in with some Christian friends. But over the course of the years, things got better between her family, parents and her. But they both passed away in the last 10, 15 years, and neither of them, as far as we know, had ever come to faith in Jesus. So, but yeah, to answer the question, both of us are Jewish. So, anyway, I've got 11:51, so we're out of time. But we'll be there for lunch, and I'll be here for a little while afterwards if anybody has any questions or something. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Are you sure? Okay. 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 See you later. Or see you tomorrow. Yeah.